quality is subjective and that families are the ones who ultimately decide what quality looks like to them and what quality matters. You're seeing public schools, district schools closing because of low enrollment. The biggest challenge now is we just need more founders to create the supply of these creative schooling options that families really demand.
Are you interested in innovative education and diversity in school models? Do you see a need for something different to bring about a reformation in our current education system? If so, then you've come to the right place. Join us as we discuss what's trending with unconventional learning models, including microschools, homeschool co-ops, creative learning centers, hybrid school models, and so much more. I am your host, Delina Wallace, president and founder of Wichita Innovative Schools and Educators, also known as WISE. This podcast, Wise and Otherwise, explores what our local hub of education entrepreneurs are doing in Wichita. We will also explore and offer brief introductions to the many local and national organizations that support innovation and education. Welcome to Wise and Otherwise.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Wise and Otherwise. Today I have with me Kerry McDonald. I consider her a friend and a peer. I admire her so much and her work. Kerry is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, where she leads the Education Entrepreneurship Lab and hosts a Liberated podcast. She's also the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at State Policy Network, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a regular contributor at Forbes.com and the 74. Kerry is the best-selling author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, and the author of the forthcoming book, Joyful Learning, How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. Kerry, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Delina. I am, as you know, a huge fan of your work. I love our times when we're able to travel to different microschools and visit education entrepreneurs all across the country. And so it's a delight to be able to be with you on your great podcast.
Well, you are a busy woman. Even just in introductions here, I was like, where do I even start? How can I tell everybody all of the work that you're doing? What's your favorite role? What do you do that you really enjoy more than anything?
Oh, gosh. Well, I suppose being a mom of four children who have learned in all sorts of different ways, but mostly outside of a conventional classroom. And that's really informed a lot of my writing and my work over the years. My oldest is graduating from being a lifelong homeschooler and heading off to college in the fall. And so it's sort of an end of that kind of homeschooling era for her. My three younger ones are still learning in a Sudbury model school, which is one of sort of the original self-directed alternative education models dating back to the 1960s that I write about at length in both Unschooled, my 2019 book, and then again in my forthcoming book, Joyful Learning. And so that's probably the second thing that's most exciting for me now is awaiting the arrival on bookstore shelves of Joyful Learning this coming August.
That's so exciting. Well, I can't wait to read it and everything that you put out, your articles and everything. You are a very gifted writer, and that's something I really, really admire. You are not only out there in the front lines, you're experiencing this yourself as a mom, raising your children with this method in education. And you're also a huge advocate and supporter of those who are out there doing this, operating these microschools and hybrid schools. Let's talk about why. Why is this so important that we have these types of diverse models and unconventional schooling? What are the stakes and what's happening in education?
Yeah, Delina, it's such an exciting time in education. I've been involved in education and education policy for over 20 years. And I always say I've never been more energized or optimistic than I am right now, largely due to these entrepreneurial parents and teachers like you who are creating innovative educational models, like you mentioned, microschools and hybrid schools and learning pods and a whole assortment of creative homeschooling collaboratives. that are really transforming education in this country from the bottom up. I don't think that that's an overstatement. I really think that the work of these everyday entrepreneurs is showing what's possible in education. It's encouraging more founders to go off and create these new innovative learning models. And then, as they're kind of expanding the supply of these new options, parents realize that there are more possibilities for them and their children. And they, as families, begin to sort of demand and seek out these creative schooling options. And then the cycle just builds and builds and builds on itself. And this isn't, as you know, this isn't a new movement. You and I were homeschooling well before it became trendy in the last 5 years. Of course, it was increasing in popularity and growing in terms of numbers over the past several decades. But beginning in 2020, and sort of the disruption caused by school closures and prolonged remote learning, that really thrust homeschooling and other types of unconventional educational models into the forefront. Parents, I think, really beginning in 2020, kind of poked their head up when the local district school was closed and said, what else is available for my children? And then they discovered this whole world that, again, of course, you and I knew existed, but not everybody did. And then they started to say, wow, education can look different than a typical, conventional classroom in an assigned district school. And many parents, beginning in the summer of 2020, started creating their own pandemic pods, these sort of spontaneous learning communities, which we would sort of think about as sort of homeschool co-ops or other types of co-learning communities. And many of those evolved into sort of full-fledged microschools that many of which continue today and are flourishing. And so I really think that disruption in 2020 unleashed a period of experimentation, innovation, and openness to new educational models that continues today, and I would argue is gaining momentum. I really think that we're just at the beginning, frankly, of this movement towards embracing innovative, choice-enabled, entrepreneur-driven, personalized learning models.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see this. You get the broad picture. You go all across the U.S. I know you and I have talked about this, but we both have met Dr. James Tooley and have read his book. We're inspired by his work, and he's been in other countries. Oftentimes it's in third world countries, and he goes off exploring and trying to uncover these private low-cost schools that exist. And a lot of times he'll go into an area and ask the government officials there, where are your private schools? And they'll be in denial, and they're like, oh, we don't have any schools like that. And he's like, oh, really? And then he'll go out and he'll find them, and he'll ask the parents who they use to educate their children. And so he gets to go and visit and meet all of these amazing schools. So when I learned about his work, and I learned about your work going across the U.S., doing similar things, meeting these school founders, I just really was inspired. And I thought, I want to be like the Dr. James Tooley, but I want to be like the Kerry McDonald, but the one in Kansas. Like, I want to be doing that work here in Kansas and visiting the schools and telling the story and highlighting this movement. I like to say that because Kansas is in the heart of America, like we are right here in the geographic center of the U.S. And so whatever's happening in Kansas is indicative of what is happening all across the country. And if enrollment is down in our public schools here in Kansas, you can believe it's happening everywhere. And if there's certain agendas and there's things that are happening throughout public school that families are unhappy with, and that's happening right here in Kansas, in the Midwest, in farm country, and all of these things, it's happening everywhere else. So I would like to ask, from your perspective, what do you see as far as parents? What's happening? Is there a pattern that you're seeing? What are parents looking for? And in your book, Joyful Learning, you talk about the importance of having these types of options. And what does that stem from for the parents and the children? What are they longing for?
Yeah. Well, first I'll just back up, Delina, and say that I do think that Kansas and your area in Wichita, with the WISE group, you really are at the epicenter of all of this innovation and creativity in education. And, kudos to you for kind of in the early days of VELA launching its grant program, micro grant program for founders of these innovative learning spaces and creating that kind of robust founder network of support. You were out there connecting with these other innovative educators in your backyard, many of whom you didn't know existed, sort of following James Tooley, as you said, and realizing that there's so much there in your backyard that you didn't know about. And if you didn't know about it, then other people didn't know about it. And of course, then gathering with a group of people to create WISE and really providing that hyper local resource for families and founders to build community and gain inspiration and encouragement, whether they're building innovative learning environments or they're seeking them out as families or both, right? Because as we know, many of the parents, that we talk to go out in search of the ideal educational environment for their kids. They can't find it, so then they go off and build it, which I think is another really fascinating part of this overall movement, this overall work. But I think what really happened, again, this movement had been building pre-2020, but I think what's really been happening for families is they're looking for more personalization and responsiveness in education. And so on the personalization side, we look around us and we see that we have so much personalization in every other part of our lives. And yet education has largely been sort of standardized and stagnant over many decades. And it's getting harder and harder to ignore, right? That as so much of the rest of our lives becomes more personalized, becomes, individualized and customized to our needs, education remains a sort of one size fits all behemoth. And it's harder and harder to ignore, again, that disconnect. And I think parents are demanding that level of personalization for their kids and in education. And there's now all of these wonderful, curriculum tools and teaching and learning resources that enable personalized learning to be more accessible to more families. And so families look around and say, why isn't education responding to this? And that sort of gets to the next piece that I think parents are looking for, and that's responsiveness. So that would be more alignment with family values, right? And again, when we look at the other parts of our lives, the consumer choices we make in a marketplace every day, we choose the restaurants to eat at or the stores to shop at that reflect our distinct needs and preferences. And yet in education, we haven't to date had that robust, decentralized, dynamic marketplace of education options. It's been, again, that kind of one size fits all model. And so more and more families are saying, I want education to respond to my needs, my preferences, my values and viewpoints. And of course, now these entrepreneurial parents and teachers are stepping up to meet that demand and create the types of learning environments that families really want.
Yeah, that's great. I love to see this. And I love the term decentralization. You refer to that often. Why do you feel like decentralization is so important in an education space, in a model, an education model?
Well, I mean, I would argue decentralization is important in every space, right? We want more bottom up, consumer choices in all parts of our lives, not top down, especially coercive models like in schooling that's sort of mandated, again, under a legal threat of force. We want more of these decentralized options that, again, are reflective of our needs and values and interests and enable us to sort of pick and choose the type of environment, in this case, for education that we want for our children, again, in the same way that we would choose, the types of, doctors or healthcare providers we would go to, or the hair salons that we would visit. And we all have a variety of choices. We have so much choice, variety, and abundance in other parts of our lives. We haven't had that same choice, variety, and abundance in education until now. And you're seeing that front and center in Kansas, and especially in the greater Wichita area, with so many different models and methods to approach innovative education and different educational philosophies. Everything from sort of unschooling and self-directed models to more classical models. You have secular, you have faith-based, this wide variety of education programs to choose from. And it's just, again, such an exciting time for families to have those choices.
It is. And I hope that we have some in our audience who are listening who might not be as familiar with what these models look like. Maybe they haven't been in, I would imagine a lot of our listeners haven't been into these micro schools and these hybrid schools. Can you tell us, like, in a practical way, what does it look like to have a decentralized learning environment? When you walk into one of these schools that's community based and focused in a smaller region and with the faith and values and everything, what does it look like? How can you compare that with traditional public schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm seeing in the innovative education space really looks dramatically different than what we see in kind of a conventional classroom, because these new learning environments are being driven by everyday education entrepreneurs who have to be responsive to the needs and interests of their customers, who are their families and their students. And because these are, sort of these creative educational options, they don't have to fit the blueprint of a one size fits all, conventional classroom. So there's so many different types of models, as you know. Some of the programs run, as recognized private schools, because that's either what the founder wants to do or the families in the community value that. Other programs run as an assortment of, collaboratives for homeschoolers, whether that's a full-time option for homeschoolers, sort of at a fraction of the cost, often of a traditional private school that, again, looks nothing like a traditional private school, or a part-time or hybrid model, or you have sort of homeschool co-ops. And again, in the Wichita area, you have such an assortment of all of these different models. And I think that that's what's so exciting about this movement is it's really these entrepreneurs responding to the needs and interests of their families and students, and then iterating or creating new models to be responsive.
Yeah, I can, and also just to kind of help paint a picture, like, let's imagine that we're taking our listeners into one of the spaces. And a lot of times what we see that might look really different is that students they're probably not sitting in desks. A lot of times they have comfortable seating around, they'll have beanbag chairs, they'll have some floor seating, they have art stations, they have, over here, it's a place where you're doing your STEM activities, and maybe you've got robotics, and then there's outdoor spaces and a lot of these outdoor learning environments that are happening, forest schools and everything else, the nature-based learning. What we see as well is a school founder is responding to the needs of the family and the community. Sometimes you see that they are a bilingual school and they're offering Spanish courses at a much younger age. Oftentimes schools don't start that until the high school level. Well, if that's something that the community values and the family values, then I know of Kim Stringer here at Creative Faith Academy, Creative Kids Faith Academy. She's in Wichita, and she does not only Spanish, but sign language. And she's teaching the kids, and they're outdoors all the time. It looks so different. And as you know, I've been able to do a documentary. We have a film, the Hero film, that we just premiered and showed this last month here in Wichita, highlighting a lot of these schools across Kansas. And to see it is just to have your eyes opened and this inspiration into how schooling can look so different than whatever we thought, whatever we experienced as a child with the classroom and the traditional learning space. It does not have to look like that in any way. There's so much freedom in this, in the opportunities that exist there. So, Carrie, as you know, also, I work a lot with churches, and my goal, specifically with the Hero Project, is to partner churches with faith based learning environments that are in their community to encourage pastors and congregations to surround and support these school founders who are stepping out in faith, and they feel it as a calling, and they feel it's a ministry, and they're out there serving. Well, some churches don't see that they should operate in that space. Like maybe education is not their lane. You probably see this in other environments and communities as well, where people might not think that education is their lane. What can you say to an individual who might be concerned about what's happening in public schools in particular and for their community and the lack of options, but they honestly don't feel like this is really their thing?
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Wise and Otherwise. We'd like to ask you to take a minute and please rate and review our podcast so that others can learn more about us, and just to continue to show your support for this work that we're doing. It would mean so much. So please, if you're on Spotify or Apple or YouTube, take a minute and give us a good review.
Yeah, I would encourage them to reconsider that and recognize that it really is their thing. It could be an incredible gift for, in this case, their faith community. You know, I wrote an article in my 74 column recently about a church-based learning center here in Massachusetts, where I live. This particular learning center is connected to and affiliated with the largest Hispanic church in Worcester, Massachusetts, the city of Worcester, which is the second largest city in New England. And they opened in the fall of 2022 as a K-12 learning center, 5 days a week, for everyone is a registered homeschooler, but they're attending here full time. They have over 100 kids, and it's one of these incredibly joyful learning spaces where parents, in fact, I would say the majority of the parents that enrolled their kids in this learning center were previously in public schools. So they had no intention in many cases, these families, to become homeschoolers or to choose anything other than the local public schools. But I heard over and over from the families that I interviewed for this piece that they just weren't satisfied with the curriculum offerings at the local school. They didn't feel like the local schools were aligned with their values. They wanted something that was much more sort of faith-filled for their children. And the Learning Center, provided that wonderful opportunity. And they just last year had their first high school graduate who had multiple, college acceptance offers and all kinds of opportunities post-graduation. So they're having a tremendous amount of success there. And I think it's that sort of success that encourages other church communities and other faith communities to consider how they could support their families and their community with some of these novel educational ideas.
I love it. Yes. It's such an inspiration when you look around and see these success stories of what's happening when a pastor will partner with educators in the community and with families and provide the type of a learning environment that's going to meet their needs. Can
I just say one other thing about that too, Kathleen, because you probably see this as well. And I certainly saw this in interviewing the folks for this piece. I said, why not just become a recognized private school? Why sort of stay as a homeschool learning center? And they said, we really don't want to become a traditional private school. They could, it wouldn't be, that hard to do, but they like the sort of centering of family and the close connection and collaboration with parents, and having parents really be an integral part of the learning community that they think would maybe not happen as much. There'd be more distance between school and family in a traditional private school model. So they really want that family focus, and they want the flexibility. So homeschooling, provides that sort of time flexibility. If families want to travel or, need to take time off here and there, they're able to do that and kind of not be committed to a 5-day a week schooling model if that's not what they want. If they wanted more part-time enrollment options, if they, again, want some of that scheduling flexibility, they want to do more curriculum time at home, they have that freedom to do that. So I don't know if that's what you're also seeing in the communities that you are working with, but it's certainly something I hear about, not only from the church-based learning center communities, but from microschool founders more generally. They'll say, I have no desire to become a state recognized private school. I think that the special sauce here is the kind of freedom and flexibility of microschooling in all of its iterations.
Yeah, definitely seeing the same thing out here and having those conversations. We have a lot of conversations about accreditation and whether or not to pursue that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but I wanted to share just a brief example that I learned last week. I was touring some schools in the Kansas City area. One of the schools was a hybrid model. It's Rise Academy in Manhattan. And I was able to interview some of the parents there, and there was just this amazing story of one of the moms. She and her husband, they are both working parents and want to spend time with their kids and all of that and do the homeschooling thing. Well, what led them to the hybrid model was actually her husband had had a tragic accident and he lost his eyesight. And she tells me that when he's struggling, he's blind now, he cannot see things anymore, that they had this reality of what really matters. And they started to just reevaluate everything. And family time just became so that much more important, that they wanted to be intentional about that. And then seeing the world and traveling. And so he realizes, like, as long as you have your eyesight, you might as well go see the world. And so having that hybrid model really worked for their family, brought them the support that they needed, but also allowed them to take these adventures and to do what their family really wanted to do in the season of life. So I thought that was just such a neat example of just one of the ways that families are seeing, we want more time together. We value that. And the hybrid model is my personal favorite. I homeschool, but I'm always looking for the additional support classes and teachers that my kids can learn from, other than me. And that helps a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's also true, Delina, and I would imagine you're seeing this too, that sort of younger parents, more of the millennial or Gen Z parents, younger millennial and Gen Z parents, they're accustomed to more freedom and flexibility in their lives as a whole. People in their 20s and early 30s, for example, like remote work more. They like to have that kind of flexible work schedule. They like that personalization, and they look around and say, well, why is education so rigid, and why is it so stagnant? It's exactly the same as it was when I was in school. And so they then look around and say, well, there's these other ways of approaching education that seem to make more sense. If I don't have to be in an office 5 days a week, why do my kids have to be in a concrete building 5 days a week with minimal flexibility? So I think younger parents, the kind of rising generation of parents, are also demanding these innovative education models.
Yeah. So I would love to, as we begin to kind of wrap up the conversation here, let's talk about some of the resistance and some of the concerns that people have, and parents might have concerns, pastors might have concerns. How do we know that good quality education is happening in these types of learning environments that look so different? What do you view as quality education, and how is that measured?
So I talk a lot about this in Joyful Learning, and I really make the point that quality is subjective, and that families are the ones who ultimately decide what quality looks like to them and what quality matters. And again, it's the same way that we think about quality in other parts of our lives. When we go and get our hair styled, right? We're looking at the different hair salons and barbershops available around us. How do we decide which is the highest quality, which is the one that's going to be the best for us? Well, there's all kinds of ways, right? We ask around to our friends, we look on Yelp and find Yelp reviews, we go, maybe take a peek inside and see what it looks like to us. we make these subjective value judgments based on what we're looking for. Again, in all other kinds of consumer choices. Now we have the opportunity to do that in education. And that's going to look different for every family. For some families, a quality educational environment for their kids is going to mean being outside all day in a forest school type of environment with their kids stomping in the mud and getting dirty and playing for a large portion of the day. For other families, quality education is going to look like sitting at a desk, going through kind of a conventional curriculum in core subjects with standardized testing and everything in between. And that's okay because now we have that whole variety, all of that choice to be able to decide what is right for our children. And it could be different for each of our children. And that's great too.
Do you feel like accreditation is a requirement or should be a requirement for there to be high quality education that's happening in the school buildings?
I think accreditation is one of these terms that people, they hear this term, they think accredited private school or an accredited school, and they think, oh, that must mean quality. And really, accreditation is just a third party verification of something. It would be like the analogy I like to use is lead certification in buildings. So if you ever look at sort of these environmentally sustainable buildings, they'll often try to get what is known as a LEED certification, meaning that they use sort of the most environmentally sustainable building practices available and materials available. And so then they get that LEED certification, LEED. That's what accreditation is too. And as long as it's something that the founder wants and feels like would be of value to their community, then that's fine. And if that's what families want, then that's fine too. But I think folks should be aware that accreditation isn't necessarily a mark of quality. It's just a third party certification saying that this particular school does this particular thing in this particular way. And again, as long as it's sort of a voluntary decision on the part of the founder and not mandated by the government or kind of education policymakers, then that's fine. But, it's also important to note that many public schools aren't accredited. Accreditation is not required in many states for public schools even. So just to kind of think a little bit more, push back a little bit against that term. Another piece with accreditation to be aware of is sometimes, especially when there is sort of government involvement in the education sector, particularly private education and departments of education may mandate accreditation in certain cases for private schools. That can be a mechanism to limit innovation and to protect incumbents. So kind of existing schools or school networks or existing traditional models of schooling. And it can prevent these newcomers from emerging. It can prevent some of these innovative models like forest schools from even getting off the ground. So just to be aware of kind of the pros and cons, I suppose, of accreditation.
Yeah. Another like hot topic out there that parents and teachers and school founders like to hear about is this idea of the school choice movement and education savings accounts and these policies that are passing in other states. We don't have a very robust school choice program here in Kansas yet. But what are your thoughts in particular regarding like these private independent schools, religious schools that want to really be able to maintain their freedom and teach what they want? Do you see any problem there, or would you hesitate to accept any government funding when you really want to preserve your freedom?
Yeah, so a couple of things on that note. First, this movement towards innovative education models is happening everywhere. It's happening in states with and without school choice policies that enable education funding to follow students to their preferred educational environment. So it's happening in places like Kansas that does not have meaningful school choice. It's happening here where I am in Massachusetts that has absolutely no private school choice policies. But it's accelerating in states with these robust school choice policies, especially states where these policies apply to microschools and hybrid schools and various types of homeschooling collaboratives. I'm seeing tremendous growth in terms of the options available to families, new entrepreneurs creating new options, entrepreneurs moving to those states so that they can open programs. For example, in Joyful Learning, I talk about a former charter school founder who opened a charter school in Baltimore and led that for a number of years, and then found that the charter sector became increasingly standardized and often looked very similar to kind of traditional district schools. And he wanted something else. He wanted sort of that experimentation and innovation that was the promise of the charter sector when it first began in the 1990s. So he ended up moving to Arizona to open his own microschool so that he could have, he could create the kind of learning environment that he knew families wanted and that students would benefit from. And it's going fabulously. And again, families are able to attend at a reduced tuition rate thanks to the Universal Education Savings Account program in Arizona. So right now we have about 16 states that have universal school choice applying to all K-12 students. 35 states plus DC and Puerto Rico have some version of private school choice. And with the passage of universal choice in Texas recently, now more than half of all K-12 students in the country are eligible for some version of private school choice. So it's just such an exciting time. And again, I think that that's contributing to a lot of this entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think it's just starting. We're going to see the expansion of these programs in the coming years. So in terms of concerns around homeschoolers or microschoolers participating in these programs, I'm finding that the founders that I talk to, they are very eager to participate in these programs, and the families they are serving are incredibly eager to participate because these programs are now much more financially accessible than they otherwise would be. I think a lot of families never even considered a private education option, even including homeschooling, because the cost or the opportunity cost was just so high. And now there's just, so much more possibility there. Of course, we always have to be watchful for regulation. We always have to push back against sort of any efforts to constrain the private education sector, and homeschooling as part of that. But I think the reality is that the government, because of compulsory schooling laws in every state, the government does have the ability to regulate education, private education and homeschooling. And that can happen whether or not you're in a state with private school choice programs. Take my state of Massachusetts, one of the most difficult states to homeschool in due to significant homeschooling regulations. And we have zero private school choice programs. So the government can always regulate private education and homeschooling. What I find, in fact, is that there's less regulation of homeschooling and private education in states that have adopted robust school choice policies, because there's this climate of parental choice and empowerment in education in a lot of these states that simply doesn't exist certainly in states like mine.
It's very interesting to just follow these trends and be paying attention to what's happening in other states and keep an eye on things there. So Kerry, let's paint a picture now for families who are listening, for educators. What do you see in the future? What if every family had access to this joyful learning environment that you're talking about? How could this transform communities and families?
Yeah, I don't think we have to imagine this. I think this is already happening. You're seeing it happening in Wichita. I'm seeing it happening at an accelerating rate in certain areas that have these robust universal school choice policies. I think about South Florida, for example, where I know you and I have visited a number of times, and seeing the really innovative learning communities sprouting there, from these kind of low cost, personalized private schools to microschools for homeschoolers to various a la carte homeschooling options. There's a huge homeschooling population there that's being supported in all kinds of different ways. You're seeing public schools, district schools closing because of low enrollment in South Florida, in particular, Broward County especially because families are choosing with their feet to go to some of these other more innovative, more personalized options. I think about, the kind of greater Phoenix, Arizona area is another place where families are able to choose from a whole assortment of educational options, again, aligned with their personal values, their personal viewpoints, the needs of their individual children. And I think the biggest challenge, frankly, is that these programs often fill to capacity very quickly because there's so much unmet demand. And so it's a signal, and it should be a growing signal for aspiring entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial parents and teachers, to recognize that there is so much opportunity to create just the ideal learning environment that you imagine, because that's what families are really looking for. So I think that that's probably the biggest challenge now, is we just need more founders create the supply of these creative schooling options that families really demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no better time than right now to get started. And as we're seeing, you don't have to be a certified teacher. A lot of times, people think they might not be qualified. But what we see is that if you have a love for children and your community and a love for learning, and you can think outside of the box, and you're a creative thinker and a problem solver, you might be the next school founder in your community, providing options for families. So thanks, Kerry, so much for the encouragement. It's just so always inspiring to talk to you and to hear what you're seeing out there. And I can't wait to read your book. Tell us one more time, how can we find your book? When's it out? And how can people get in touch with you?
Thanks, Delina. Yeah, always so great to talk with you as well. The book, again, is called Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. It's available for pre-order now wherever you buy your books, either at your local bookstore or favorite online retailer. You can also go to my new site, the Education Entrepreneurship Lab, at the Foundation for Economic Education. That website is edentrepreneur.org, where you'll see lots of resources for founders and aspiring school founders, as well as families searching for new options. And you'll see the pre-order link for the book there as well.
That's so exciting. Well, Kerry, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Delina.